again, and welcome to our next module. What we're going to be looking at in this module is the issue of immigration. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the issue of immigration into the United States in the 21st century through the perspective of Catholic social teaching. And obviously, this is going to be rooted in a lot of the principles that we've been talking about and is going to be dealing with the crisis surrounding illegal immigration into the United States today. And as I'm sure all of you are well aware, this is a very controversial issue in America today, both in the political realm and also in theological circles, right? That there's a lot of debate about how we ought best to understand and deal with this situation as Christians or as people who are seeking to live out our faith or follow the Bible's guidance. Now, I'm going to try another little experiment here in this module in terms of how to cover this topic. We could run through kind of a standard account of all the different principles of Catholic social teaching that are pertinent here, and then point you to some readings and do our standard thing. But I thought I might try something a little different. So what I want to do is just give you a very brief introduction to the topic using the principles of Catholic social teaching we've been talking about, talk about some of the basic problems. And then what I'm going to do is to direct you to either a documentary film that I would ask you to watch, giving you a perspective of those who are involved in this immigration, or if that's not something that you are able to do via streaming or because of cost or any other reasons, there's also a report put out by the U.S. And Mexican bishops' conferences that you could read instead of watching the documentary. And so either one of those two approaches will give you kind of the bulk of the material that I want us to then talk about on the discussion board. So that's going to be our plan, is a real quick introduction. And then probably for most of you, you'd probably choose to pay a few dollars and watch a documentary online. But if you'd rather not do that for whatever reason, you can read this report, and then we can get probably a perspective from both as we move on to Blackboard to discuss these issues. But very briefly, before we move to either of those steps, either a documentary or the report, I just want to walk through real quickly how I would see this issue breaking down in terms of analysis of Catholic social teaching and Catholic ethics. Right? And one way that I've presented on this topic in the past is to start with the approach of asking, is illegal immigration immoral? Which is, I think, a question that kind of gets right to the point. And right, it seems like when we ask the question of is illegal immigration immoral, that the answer seems to be that we should say yes, right? Because look, in the vast majority of cases, something that is illegal is immoral. If for no other reason, because we ought to follow the governmental authorities that have been set up. We learn this from the Bible, from Romans 13, and we learn it from natural law, right? That human societies work best, people tend to flourish when we have an orderly, law-governed society. But of course, we all know that there are situations where what is legal and what is moral don't necessarily coincide. Right, that there can be things that are legal that are in fact immoral, and there can be things that are illegal that are in fact moral. In terms of things that are illegal but are actually moral, there are any number of examples we could point to. One of the ones that comes first to my mind comes from the book of Tobit, one of my favorite biblical books. Right, and much of the story is really built around the fact that Tobit, this pious Jew, is doing something that is illegal in his state, right? He is burying the dead who have been executed as kind of examples to the populace. And he's going out and burying them despite the fact that the government tells him not to. And so this is a clear biblical instance of somebody doing something that's illegal, but of course it is moral. And if you have been in the course discussing natural law, we've talked about examples in natural law where someone could do something that's illegal, but it would in fact be moral, right? And one example was a situation where if a rich old miser has a warehouse full of bread, and there's a famine in the land and people are starving in the streets, that it would not in fact be immoral for people to forcibly take that bread away from him, because from a natural law perspective, right, he doesn't really have a right to that bread in that sort of situation. And so it is not in fact wrong to take it from him because it is not rightfully his in the first place. And here you can probably see where we're going with this in terms of thinking about illegal immigration. Because many people would argue that in fact what we have with the illegal immigration going on in America today is a situation not terribly dissimilar from that. That we live in a situation where there are millions and millions of people in Central and South America especially, but in other places in the world as well, where they are living in desperate poverty, and where there are no obvious routes to legally rectifying that situation, right? Where they really don't have legal, easily available options for not only improving their lives, but also just providing basic necessities for their family and allowing their families to flourish in the way that we have talked about over and over as the ideal for Catholic social teaching and natural law. So we have that situation, and then we have, of course, a nation where there's a great deal of material prosperity, right, and where there is an abundance of goods, despite the fact that there are certainly those who struggle to get by in America. For the most part, if we're just going to look at the amount of goods available in our country, we have more than enough to meet the basic needs of everyone here. And so given that situation, how ought we to think about it, right? Well, it seems in many ways that this would be analogous to the warehouse and the starving masses scenario, right? That we have a surplus of goods in this country, and we have millions of people who lack basic goods. And given the Catholic social teaching principle of the universal destination of goods, it seems to make sense that those goods are in some ways destined for all people and ought to be available to those who lack the means to support themselves and their families in these other countries. And so that's really where this question of what's illegal and what's immoral becomes vexed, to say the least, right? And so that's one way of looking at it, right? Another approach, I think, that complicates this further, or maybe takes the analogy further, right, is that one could argue, I think fairly persuasively, that it's not as if the United States is purely neutral in this process, right? That there are things, policies that the United States has in place that exacerbate the situation. And again, there's any number of these, and you can see them in the documentary or in the bishop's report. But just to briefly mention them, one of the huge issues was the passage of NAFTA several years ago now. But when NAFTA was enacted into law, it eliminated all barriers to trade between the United States and Mexico, amongst other things it did. And prior to that point, right, Mexican farming had been insulated from direct competition with U.S. Agriculture. But when that was eliminated by the passage of NAFTA, immediately most of Mexico's farmers, or a huge number of Mexico's farmers, were basically forced out of business because there was no way for these small-scale, very traditional farmers to compete with modern industrial American agriculture. Of course, this was a boon for, in many ways, the U.S. economy and trade, but it was a disaster for Mexico's agricultural communities. And so what are these families to do in this situation? Well, they have to provide for their families, and so it seems reasonable that they're going to follow where the money went, right? And so where the money went is to basically the United States, right? And that's where the resources are now available, and that is where they're going, right? And there are a whole host of other policies and issues that we could talk about along those lines, right? The other big thing, of course, that complicates this is the U.S. Approach to dealing with the desire of immigrants to come to the U.S. To earn money. And to maybe go back to the very beginning, many of you have been thinking, well, what's the problem here? Illegal immigration is wrong because they should be doing this legally. And this is, again, one of the things that the bishops highlight and that the documentary will highlight as well, namely that the opportunities for legal immigration into the United States are very limited, that there are very few work visas or legal permits to work in the United States, especially in comparison to the huge numbers of people seeking that employment and in comparison to the huge demand for those workers from U.S. Companies and industries. And again, there have been lots of stories in recent years about this problem and how when some states have really cracked down on illegal immigration, it has created real crises for the agricultural industry in the state, for example, because they simply cannot get U.S. citizens to perform many of these jobs. There are immigrants who would do them if they're able to, but our legal system does not allow sufficient numbers to come and perform the work that people want them to perform and that they want to perform. Right? And so the takeaway from both the documentary and the bishop's report will be, amongst other things, that we need to dramatically increase both the numbers of immigrants who can work in the United States legally and the process for making that happen bureaucratically. And so, again, these economic forces, these political choices have conspired to create a situation, again, analogous to that warehouse of bread and the starving people, right, where there are resources available, but they are kept away from the people who need them for a variety of reasons. And so the response being suggested by the bishops in the documentary and by Catholic social teaching, I think, is not a more rigorous enforcement of the borders and the boundaries, but rather a way of thinking about how we produce a better distribution of goods to meet the needs of all the people who need goods to flourish and provide for their families. So those are some of the key issues that are going to be raised by the documentary or by the report. So I just wanted to talk about them ahead of time so that you can be thinking about them as you read or as you watch. And then what I want you to do after you do that is to come back onto Blackboard and discuss your reactions to either the film or to the report. Right? Do you agree with these general ideas of dramatically expanding the ease and availability of legal immigration? Do you agree that it might be moral for immigrants to seek entry to the U.S. even if it is illegal? And then explain, of course, why or why not in regard to either of those questions. And then, of course, feel free to bring up any other questions you might have having read this material or having watched the documentary. And of course, I'll just wrap up by saying, in my own experience kind of teaching around the Wichita Diocese here, this is one of the topics where there is probably the most disagreement and debate. The bishops, I think, have spoken pretty clearly and consistently on this, but there is a lot of resistance to many of those proposals. That's not to say that resistance is irrational or that there is not good reasoning behind many of the qualms people have with some of the suggestions. But I do think it's an important thing for us to talk about, especially for people who are going to be talking about ethical, social issues in parishes and in the diocese, because this is a very contested issue. So I would be interested in hearing your reactions to this in ways that you might have suggest for how we could deal with this topic most effectively when we're trying to share our faith with others. So I will wrap up for now. I'll send you on to do some further watching or reading, and then we can come back together and discuss what you all think.